Hi, and welcome to Radio Out There. I'm Barry Eaton. Well, this week, something very different. It's a panel discussion. Never had one of those in 22 years, examining the psychological impact of spiritual transcendence. We've talked a lot about the afterlife and many aspects of that over the years on this program. But now this is a study of afterlife consciousness via life between lives hypnotherapy. And the study is the basis of a dissertation by Dr. Serena Vallari, submitted to the Wright Institute in the US for her doctorate in clinical psychology. So while it's academic, we're going to be talking about the whole reasons for and about it. Firstly, I'm going to talk to Pete Smith, a frequent guest on Radio Out There. So many of you will know him. And we've talked about life between lives, quantum consciousness, past life, hypnotherapy, a whole lot more on the program over the last 7 or 8 years. Now, Pete is the past president of the Michael Newton Institute, and he and I have worked together on several projects, including my last book that I wrote called Past Lives Unveiled. Pete, hi, welcome. Thanks for organising what promises to be a fascinating program. In fact, you organised it, so you're almost like the executive producer. Anyway, welcome.
I might be a bit out of my depth there, Barry, but thank you. And it's just, it's fantastic to be here. And again, I want to say to your listeners that thank you for all you've done for the Michael Newton Institute over the years and offering us wonderful airtime to talk about what we do. And I remember when we did the tribute show to Michael after he passed in 2016, and that was a wonderful episode. So, we're grateful for your support for what you do for us. But it's my great pleasure to talk about the other 3 people who are on the panel here today. And incredible academic qualifications, life experiences, but I'd like to make it a little bit more personal. And if I can talk about Matt, first of all, Dr. Matt McKay. Now, Matt's the co-founder of New Harbinger Press, but besides that, he's got an incredible background in psychology. He's a professor at the Wright Institute in Berkeley. But on top of that, I remember a wonderful conversation that Matt and I had. And whilst he might have published self-help books, co-authored a whole lot of them, and he might have sold something like in excess of 4 million copies of these books, from what I'm told, the one that really won my heart was Seeking Jordan, when he wrote that incredible book about the tragic loss of his son and how that opened up new avenues into the afterlife. So I met Matt around that time when he was publishing that, and I remember looking out over the bay at a beautiful lunch and talking about consciousness, and I could have stayed there for days. It was a fantastic afternoon. So, Matt's got so much to offer in terms of strong psychological background, but also the afterlife connections that show us who we really are in this universe. So it's great to have Matt here with us today. Next is my dear friend and close colleague, Dr. Diana Paik, who's been the executive director of the Newton Institute for around over 4 years now, I think, Diana, isn't it? So, we serve the Michael Newton Institute side by side on the board. And she's got her own incredible background across public life, administration, which her own doctorate's in. And she's a renowned LBL therapist. She's become our spokesperson for the Michael Newton Institute in recent years as well. So she's leading this work from the front. And, there's a few other little esoteric things in the background, like Reiki Master and all those other things that make us up into the metaphysical beings that we are. But we're delighted to have Diana here with us as well. And both of those have been strong supporters for the next person that I'd like to introduce, which is Dr. Serena Vallari, and the work that she's done. And even in perhaps a period of life, I don't want to be ageist here for a minute, but somebody who seems to have crammed about 4 lifetimes into one so far, while still being in the first half of life, perhaps. But there's something here about Serena's own academic qualifications, undergrad studies at Columbia, the Wright Institute for the doctorate, a clinical internship at Harvard Medical School and now postdoc fellowship coming up in the psychiatry department of Stanford Medicine. So there's some incredible things there. And somewhere along the way, she managed to cram in a semester or so at the University of Seville in Spain, just to tune up her Spanish to make sure that she could use that whenever she needed to. But when I look at Serena's background, something else comes to me, and that is that she wants to make a difference. And whether it's teaching sixth graders in the Teach for America program, educating year niners in the peer health exchange, educating them about the important things of the world, helping out in the Doctors Without Borders program, or even just being part of the San Francisco suicide prevention hotline. And that's where you really learn the rough side of what we can offer through mental health. So, she comes with all of those qualifications, but the really exciting part for me is this doctorate that we're talking about today, which is the first one in this particular field of work of life between lives. And I think it's breaking new ground, but I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. So I'm just going to say welcome to all of you and hand back to Barry.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Pete. Lovely to meet everybody on the panel. And as we said before, the study is the basis of a dissertation by Serena, submitted to the Wright Institute in the US for her doctorate in clinical psychology. So, Serena, welcome. And why don't you tell us, give us an overview of your dissertation, why you wrote it, and tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's such an honor to be here today. So the dissertation is about the psychological impact of experiencing afterlife consciousness through some form of spiritual transcendence. We've known that for centuries, for as long as we can trace back humanity, people have been curious about the afterlife and spiritual experience beyond what we know our lives to be in our bodies. But interestingly, we don't have a lot of information about what happens to someone before and after they go through such an experience. We know humans have been curious about it. We have case reports of people who have had near-death experiences and what they share about them after the fact. But as far as I could see in the scientific literature, there had never been a study that really looked at the changes within people psychologically, for the very simple reason that you can't assign someone to go through a near-death experience. That would obviously be unethical. You can't assign someone to die and report back. So you can't really get information on what someone was like before they had such an experience. And that's where the Michael Newton Institute and Life Between Lives hypnotherapy comes in. Life Between Lives hypnotherapy is a way that one can hypnotically experience a sense of their self beyond their current body, and they can experience themselves as a being across time. And one thing that people can access while undergoing Life Between Lives hypnotherapy is a sense of who they were previously, not only in past lives, but also more critically in the space between lives, the space where you have passed from previous life and you're in that space that we're also curious about the afterlife before you decide to come back to reincarnate. Before you or during the time when you understand what's this whole point of existence about? Who are my guides? What's my purpose here? What am I here to learn? It's a really fascinating psychological experience, and I wanted to study it because I was curious what happens to someone who undergoes that. And because I am a clinical psychologist, my questions were largely about psychologically. Very simply, my question was, well, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is it a neutral thing? What changes? And I studied some specific constructs like what happens to your fear of death after you go through such a process? What happens to any anxiety or depression you may have had? What happens to your sense of meaning in life? What happens to your search for meaning of life, that yearning that you have to understand more? I mean, does it increase, or do you have so many more questions? Does it decrease? And so that's what I set out to do. I was really lucky to have Dr. Matt McKay as my dissertation chair and Dr. Diana Pack as my second reader. Diana Pack especially was critical in this research because she is a leader of the Michael Newton Institute, and as such, she provided access to the facilitators who do this type of hypnosis. So what Diana did was she contacted individuals who are certified in Life Between Lives hypnotherapy. And the fact that there is a certification process for Life Between Lives hypnotherapy to conduct it, to guide people through it, is really a boon for research, because that means there's standardization around it. So she contacted these people who do it and said, hey, for your clients who are coming in who are seeking this, there's a researcher who's studying what we do. Can you ask your clients to take some measures that the researcher has about their psychological makeup before you go through the Life Between Lives hypnotherapy process? At that point, the participants, people like you and me who are curious about their afterlife consciousness, who want to go through Life Between Lives hypnotherapy, may choose to take the measures. And if they do, and then they undergo Life Between Lives hypnotherapy, 1 month later, they'll hear from me again saying, hey, I'm back again. It's been a month. Can you take these same measures again? And so then what I did was I compared what people were self-reporting about their psychological well-being after Life Between Lives hypnotherapy with how they were saying they were before they went through it. And the results were really incredible. Across every measure that I studied, people got better on average. And that was such an amazing finding, because it was really, there wasn't a lot of information in the scientific literature to support the hypothesis that quantitatively and psychologically people would get better, but they really did. Of note, some of the most striking findings for me personally were that fear of death across many different constructs really decreased for people.
Well, I can imagine this would be the real key to it, Serena. And we want to go into this in detail as part of our panel discussion. So if I can ask at this stage, Matt, to talk about the angle from a psychology lecturer and academic to find a dissertation of this nature, Matt. What's your take on it all?
Well, of course, I've done quite a few Life Between Life regressions myself, and I'm familiar with it. And I've seen the miraculous impact that it can have on individuals who undergo the experience. So I have a personal sense of what it means to be able to peer into the afterlife and see what exists there. In this particular case, Serena was so interested and so fascinated with this question that she wanted to do more than just simply notice and observe the experience. She wanted to find out how it impacts us, what changes it makes in our emotional and psychological life. And she can go into the details of that. But I guess there are a couple of things that I want to say in terms of what I see the kind of the larger impact of Life Between Life regressions, what that can have on a human being. The first is, we live with such a sense of aloneness on this planet. And one of the things that Life Between Life, that regression affords is a peek into the profound sense of connectedness that we all have. Our belonging to our soul group, our belonging to all of basically all of consciousness. And that sense of belonging can be experienced when we have these brief sojourns in the life between life. So the first thing is helping people get a deeper sense of belonging. And another thing that I've seen over and over again with the LBL hypnotic experience, which I think is maybe the most important thing, is being able to identify your life purpose. Why are you coming to the planet now? And we can help people recognize that by going to that point in the afterlife where they choose and make decisions about what new incarnation they want to be engaged with and what kind of lesson plan they want for that life. And so the opportunity to learn about our life purpose is extraordinary, and I think it's the key, at least in the work I've done, that gives people a deeper sense of meaning. Why am I here? What's the point of all of this pain, actually, that we go through on this planet? Mm-hmm. And of course, there's losing the fear of death, which Serena will talk about. I mean, that was extraordinary. And while just anecdotally, people will say, "I feel so different about death." Serena's research really shows that changes profoundly with this process. The other thing, if I could just say briefly, is I think the LBL experience changes our relationship to pain. Instead of just being, pain is like it's unfortunate, or the sense that we somehow made a mistake or screwed up, and pain is a consequence of some sort of life failure. It actually becomes clear that pain is part of the lesson plan for each life, and the things that we experience that are painful, far from being a sign of failure, are an indication that we're deep in the learning process and the reason we came here. So I think that's another experience that so often people gather and gain. And the last thing I guess I wanted to mention is a real change in the relationship to time and aging. Rather than time being something that robs us of our vitality and brings us step by step closer to death, time becomes just an opportunity for learning. And rather than bringing us closer to death, it helps us complete our life purpose, our reason we came here. Time gives us an opportunity to keep learning the vital lessons that were part of our lesson plan when we incarnated. So those are some of the things that I've noticed and seen in the process of doing this work, and and how important it is in terms of people's psychological health.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Matt. Very well sort of summarized there, I think. Diana, you're with the Michael Newton Institute. What is this dissertation and all the work that's involved in Serena's dissertation? How has that impacted, and what's happening at the Institute now?
Well, we were absolutely thrilled when Serena came forward with this idea of doing a dissertation. And I heard about it on a New Year's Day. So it was like the beginning of a year. Here we have a new project and a new opportunity. And one of the challenges of any organization and any work that you do is to have it validated by people who do similar work. And for the Newton Institute, we've always wanted to be seen by the psychological community as having value, that what we do is valuable. And we're not just some kind of woo-woo group out there doing something that we think is valuable, but the rest of the world thinks we're not something that's important. And so it leads back to where Michael started in his work, that he was very grounded in his research. And he believed that you have to know about what you're doing. And he kept data on what he found, which is where his books came from. So they're very data driven. And so when Serena came forward wanting to do a dissertation, we were really thrilled to be able to not only say, yes, we like this idea, but to actually work with her through the process of designing the study so that it not only met the needs for her dissertation, but it met our needs as an organization to learn about how people perceive their journey, how they perceive life. We wanted to know how people felt. It's hard to measure how people feel. You know, it's very difficult because it's all within you. It's a perception. And so it's a qualitative research that we're wanting, and she's wanting to do something quantitative. Well, having something where you can measure it and having standard psychological measures helped us because the psychological literature is based on things that it knows. And the Newton Institute has never had research published in a standard psychological forum, in a psychological journal. So we were really looking for that bridge into the world of psychotherapy in a way that showed the validity of what we do and how it can augment other kinds of therapies. And so Serena was very open to allowing us to work together to figure out how do we do that? How do we create a study? So it was a study that was designed in a coordinated way so that the Newton Institute could have what it needed and could get some answers for what we cared about, because we tried to study this internally. And so we had questions about how do people feel afterwards? How do they feel before? You know, the learning about life and death, pain. It's a challenge to study pain because people can come in having a child die and their grief doesn't go away in the 2 months that you are doing the study. So how do we represent that? Because people do come in various stages of pain and grief and trauma. And how do we then work that through and have it be meaningful? And so this was a study. This is the first study that has been done as a doctoral dissertation and done in such a rigorous way that gave us real data and that had outcomes that were meaningful and significant. So for us, that's an opening. And we see it as a way to ground ourselves and to connect with other therapies that are coming forward that connect people to consciousness and show that there's a validity in moving out of an incarnation into the soul self, into the grounded true self, which is where you are when you are connected to consciousness.
Okay, well, thank you, Diana, and thank you, Matt, and also Serena. I think what we do now is open up for discussion, panel discussion on all sorts of topics related to your dissertation, Serena. And the one that I picked up immediately, because I've written 3 books about the afterlife and all the effects and whatever, is the fear of death, because that was one of the prime reasons I wrote my first book, Afterlife, to help allay these fears. And I was told from the other side, help, we need all sorts of people getting out there spreading this information. So, Serena, the fear of death, maybe you'd like to just make a quick comment on how it has allayed the fear of death.
Yeah, so that was one of the most incredible findings of the dissertation. The construct that I used to study fear of death and how it changed for individuals broke down fear of death into 4 components: the fear of your own dying and the fear of your own death as different constructs, 2 of them, and then the fear of others dying and the fear of others' death. And if you think about it, all 4 of those fears are specific and different, unique in their own ways. And it went down across the board for, on average, by quite a bit. So people who were, for example, previously maybe even crippled by that fear reported that that fear had really lessened. When you think about what that means, if you're living your life with a lot of fear, it's going to be a pretty limited life. It's hard to live according to your values if you're so afraid of death. And when that fear lessens, a lot can open up for your life. I also think to Diana's earlier point, there can be a sense in the psychological world that the spiritual world is its own thing. It's separate, it's woo-woo, it's not really relevant. And I was really hoping that this study could bridge the two and say, look, the fear of death is a really prime psychological concept. And if spirituality and spiritual pursuits happens to be something that affects it, then that means that spiritual work is psychological work. And then one other example that I'll give, just because it's been on my mind recently, I've been reading Trust by Hernan Diaz. And it's a book that's won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a very popular book. This is not a spoiler. It happens very early on in like the first chapter, the opening chapter. We see a young girl who's very intellectually driven, who's very closely connected to her father. And her father, who's also a very smart individual, starts to really get into the question of the afterlife. And he, in fact, becomes so obsessed with trying to figure out what happens next. Then he has a huge mental breakdown, and thus a family unravels, a girl's childhood unravels. And I thought about that and about how there's this cultural perception that to engage in a spiritual pursuit, often to extremes, somehow implies that you might be damaging your mental health. You might be damaging your family. You might be hurting your loved ones if you were to really go intensely into these kinds of psychological and spiritual questions. But that's why I think the data is so important. That's a fictional story. The truth, according to the numbers and according to the data, is that people who undergo such a spiritual experience, like Life Between Lives hypnotherapy, actually do that psychologically better, not worse, with fear of death being one of those primary ways.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, thanks. So let's throw that open to the panel, and feel free to come in and make comments or ask her any questions or chat to each other or whatever, because it's a discussion. So let's open it up here now. Who'd like to come in and say something?
Well, one of the experiences I've had is, I've had many clients. I've been a psychologist for 45 years, and I've had many clients who struggled with the fear of death. And we do not have any good psychological interventions to help them. There just isn't anything that.
Why is that, Matt? Why?
Well, because fear of death is an anxiety state. And the main intervention we have for anxiety states is an exposure. We would have to expose the person to death itself in order to help them to stop fearing it.
Do you really think that? I mean, why do you have to be exposed to it? I mean, you don't have to be exposed to murder to fear murder or to be able to do something about it.
Well, when you're exposed to murder, you do become afraid of it. And it's very hard to undo that fear. I guess what I'm saying is that our standard treatment for anxiety of all kinds, fears of all kinds, is exposure. And that's particularly problematic in terms of the fear of death, because we can't expose people to death. And as a result, we don't really have our gold standard treatments don't really impact this problem. But
we're all going to die, but we're not all going to be murdered. So dying is something that's universal.
Well, if I may, I might just give a quick example about exposure therapy. Let's say, Barry, you're terribly afraid of spiders. You're afraid of spiders to the point where you can't.
How do you know that?
It's my psychic intuition.
I used to be. Yeah.
Arachnophobic. The principle of exposure is essentially that if you're someone who's really afraid of something, the way that you can overcome that fear and live your life with freedom beyond that fear is by repeatedly exposing that person to the thing that scares them so that they realize that they're not actually in threat of something. And this works when the fear is unwarranted. So, for example, one might say the fear of death is unwarranted because we're all going to die. We all have to do it. And however, just like to help you overcome your fear of spiders, Barry, I could present you with spiders until suddenly, like not suddenly, over time, you start to have a more neutral bodily and mental response to that spider because you're used to it now. It's okay. And so that's what exposing to spiders can do for a fear of spiders. It can reduce that fear.
Yeah.
Now, the issue is we can't expose someone to the experience of dying. And I think that might be what Matt is trying to say. When it comes to murder, though, murder is a legitimate fear. We don't want to be murdered. That is a legitimate fear separate from the fear of dying. And so maybe there wouldn't be a reason to expose to the fear of murder because that's a fear that possibly most people can live their lives with intact unless it's really derailing them in some way. But that might be my backstory, and I'll hand it back to Matt.
Well, I guess what I was going to suggest to you, Barry, is that LBL hypnosis is really the first planned exposure to death that we've ever come up with. That Michael Newton developed this process, and through this process, individuals can actually go through the entire experience of their demise in this or a past life, observe the transition into, in many cases, this initial landing place, and then what happens at other stages of the afterlife. And the person can actually live through their death. And that is the first opportunity we've ever had to expose people to death and help them see what it really is. And not only what the death experience is, the transition from life to spirit world is, but to see what that spirit world looks like, what it feels like, how souls live there, what do they do there, what's the point of their experience and existence in that afterlife. So it answers the question of what death is, what this transition is, and what it's like. But what's it like beyond death? What is that place that we end up in, that we end up feeling is home? So I guess I just want to encourage you to think of this as actually an extension of gold standard psychological treatments, which is exposure. But for the first time, we've been able to expose people to death, and that's why the fear of death goes down so dramatically. And one of the things, I'm sorry to be so verbose here, but the other thing that's so important about this is most of our psychological interventions take months to have any impact, to finally take seed and have a significant and extensive impact on the client. This is a one-time intervention that profoundly changes the fear of death. A single intervention. And we don't have anything like that in psychotherapy. And that's another thing that makes it so exciting and important.
But I agree. I asked that
on?
question because in my first book, I went through a regression back to dying in the past life. I died in the trenches in World War I and went through the whole thing of dying, transferring, then into the afterlife, and then on. So I know exactly what you're talking about. My point before was, why has psychology and science rejected the afterlife? Why is it not more accepted in the scientific world or the academic world? Why have we rejected this? Maybe you can all answer this one.
You can't measure it. There's this whole thing in science. If you can't objectively measure something, then it doesn't exist, or it's not worth studying. And that's what's so important about Serena's research, is that she actually has provided objective measurements of what happens to human beings who experience the afterlife via LBL. And those measurements are meaningful in the scientific community because they tell us something about how our emotions and our fears change as a result of this experience. So but that's why science has been so chary of spirituality.
Fair enough. Thanks for that. Now, Pete, you've addressed me several times, and I've had some amazing experiences. What are your thoughts on all this now?
Well, I'd like to throw something in that supports what Matt said and also goes back to something that Serena said. And I feel that we get to a stage in these, I'm going to call them adventures, because they don't necessarily have a set methodology. We sort of follow our clients as best we can into a place of unlimited potential. For me, I think we get to a stage where we leave the physical parameters of the universe behind. We move outside of time and outside of space. And I actually feel that we're remembering an out-of-body experience while still in body. I mean, that's really my definition of LBL, because I think we get to a stage where, we're disguised as hypnosis. And I think that gets us so far to get the human parts out of the way so that we can set the soul free to serve the universe. And we connect back into the afterlife because we are quantumly entangled between the human aspect of us and the immortal essence of who we are. So for me, and what Matt said is important, you can't measure the unmeasurable. It's like saying, you've got like a cup and saucer and you want to measure the size of the ocean. It's a little bit difficult to do. And the importance of this is what shows up, I feel, in Serena's research, and why I love it so much as groundbreaking work. And that's because here is a psychological measure on fear of death, and this is how much it's gone down, and it can only really relate to this out-of-body experience that these people have had facilitated. So for me, I felt obliged to drop the tag of hypnotherapist the further I got into this work and started to explore more in the field of consciousness, because I don't think we're hypnotizing people at all. We're simply helping them to remember who they really are. We're allowing their conditioning to be set to the side, and we're setting these people free to embrace their souls and to look back at this human condition from the other side and to say, I am a spiritual being having a human experience. And, we are the sum of many chapters that make up one book that is our soul. And I think it's time for people to be the book and not the chapter. And that sets us free from so much.
Yeah, fair enough. What about you, Diana?
I think that to follow up on something that Pete and Matt said about going through the experience of dying, is that you realize that the you that goes through the experience is the totality of you, and that you are leaving behind an incarnation, but you are whole, and that you are whole in your true self. Your true self lives. That's what is on the other side. It was there all along in your incarnation. But when you see that you don't go away, you are just transforming and expanding into the whole of yourself. As you leave the incarnation, you can see that the incarnation itself is not who you are. It's the journey that you were on. It's the place that you learn. And so we come into a human form, we kind of cram part of our soul into a human form for a particular journey in order to accomplish something. And when we go through that process of dying and seeing who we are, it's just such a relief to people say, oh, I'm just so relieved I'm not in the body anymore. It's just so wonderful to be, wow, this feels so good. The person who has gone through dementia for 20 years and they come out of the body and they have clarity again. And, the person who has physical ailments and they've been suffering, the suffering ends as they leave and they are whole. To experience that is to realize that these are simply experiences and that the incarnation itself is an important part of our learning as a soul, but it isn't who we are. That we are the soul, and we are always the entirety of the soul that is in connection with consciousness. And when we pay attention and can ground ourselves into that when we're in our human bodies, then we are able to connect more completely with consciousness. And so what this work really supports you doing is developing practices that ground you into yourself, your true self, and support you being connected to consciousness while in a body. So you're in this body. You can go through a journey. You can see that if I didn't finish this work, in a human life, you go, man, I didn't finish this. My life is over because I didn't finish this job. Well, on a soul level, the soul doesn't care if you finish that job or not. Doesn't care if you have a red car or a blue car. If you need transportation, you need transportation. So I think it starts to shift you into seeing yourself from that soul paradigm, that you are your soul. And when you are your soul, it shifts how you see you and how you see others and how you see life. And the value of this work, as Matt says, in one session, you can shift perspective. People who have suffered extreme hardships, who've lost children, who have, had horrible things happen, are able to look at themselves differently as a soul and see the value of what they've experienced as a part of their learning, and see that the learning that they are experiencing this lifetime probably has been going on for many lifetimes. And it takes away the need for perfection, because as humans, we can't be perfect. And I think that is part of the relief, just like the relief of leaving a body that is challenged and moving beyond is a relief, but also recognizing there's no requirement to be perfect. Yeah. There's no requirement to do anything perfectly. And it takes us many lifetimes to learn to trust ourselves, to learn to have patience, to learn to love ourselves, to learn to love others, to receive love. All of these things are very large challenges for the soul. And it's why we're here, because it's harder as humans.
Hmm. Yeah. So you talk about the soul a lot in your dissertation, and say that a lot of people believe that we can't prove we have a soul. And of course, that goes back, we've been taught for years through religion that we are a body with a soul, whereas my understanding is we are a soul using a human body to have a human experience. So what are your thoughts on the whole soul issue?
Well, there are my personal thoughts, and then there are my thoughts as a researcher.
Well, they're very different, are they?
No, they're the same. It's just that my thoughts as a researcher are more qualified in what I can say. What I mean by that is, yes, I believe that personally that we are souls, that the human body is a jacket that we try on for a certain set of experiences in this lifetime. And we shed that jacket, we put on a new one. As a researcher, I can't prove that. But what I will say is that I thought what Diana was saying was very interesting about how when you recognize that who you are is a soul more than a body, it can lead to a lot of psychological relief. Reminds me a lot of a therapeutic intervention for people who have distress, depression, anxiety, where they feel like they are their thoughts. They feel like they are their fears, they are their negative thoughts. And a huge common principle of intervention in psychology, if you go to therapy, your therapist might say, let's try to understand that those are your thoughts, but they are not you. And then it's the task of the therapist and the person sitting in the room, the patient, to determine, okay, well then, who am I? And in my mind, personally, what they're doing is they're figuring out, who's my soul? The thing is, the field of psychology isn't going to talk about it like that. The field of psychology will talk about it as in, who's the you that's beyond your thoughts? And they'll leave it open-ended. Whether a patient comes to the answer of soul or not is on them. But I hope that kind of gets to it. Yeah, I think that we are our souls, and that actually, if you take any psychological intervention in its core, if you really look at what happens in a therapy room, it's someone understanding who they are as a soul. It's just that psychology as a field isn't using those terms because we can't prove that there's a soul.
So how can we convince people that we are a soul? That's the question. What do you all think?
You can always go back to the 21 grams principle.
Yes, yeah. Explain that one, Pete.
I can't remember what year it was, but
1901, I think.
oh, was it?
I think so.
A man experimented. He was a researcher. Had a Scottish name, but I can't remember it exactly. But he measured the weight of a person just before they died and just after they died, and the difference in weight was 21 grams. And he claimed that was the weight of the human soul. And it's become more anecdotal and legendary than good solid research, I know. But it started people talking about what is the difference between a body that holds a life essence within it and one that does not. What is the difference between somebody before and after they cross? And you've only got to look at someone to understand if you've ever had the great honour of watching somebody cross. You see the before and after, you see the difference. And it's remarkable. And there are so many people who go into, these palliative care areas, and they go in full of trepidation, and they go through that death experience, that transcendence, to use the word from your dissertation, Serena, that I love so much, the transcendent experience, and to come away changed themselves. And that's part of the ripple effect of when the door opens and the afterlife is made present, and people can see somebody cross over and be part of that experience. It's a very honouring moment in somebody's life to be there with them and also to witness it yourself. So for me, a lot of this goes beyond science. It goes beyond the pieces that we need. But we still have to reach back to people with the good, solid information like Serena has put together in this wonderful dissertation, and bring people forward to say, here is the proof that we need to have a conversation that could be life-changing for you. And that starts to open new avenues of thought for these people.
Matt, do you think Serena's dissertation is going to help not only people, but science as well, to open up their minds, open up their hearts?
I'm hesitating as you ask the question, because there's a difference between what I hope and what I expect to happen. I think that science is a long way from facing the truth about the nature of the soul and how it transcends physical existence. I mean, there's been, some very profound research on, life, the near-death experiences that is very compelling. And then there's the research on that's so interesting that was done on children who remember past lives. And, I think he had 3,000 cases.
Professor Stevenson, you mean?
Stevenson, yeah. 3,000 cases, in which he solved about 1,000, and is able to identify who this child was in a previous life with an extraordinary accuracy. So we have quite a bit of evidence that the soul can exist outside the body, and in fact that the soul can move from body to body. But science is still very reluctant to look seriously at that. And, I don't expect
are they
to
reluctant?
do so anytime soon.
But why are they reluctant? Is it because of their training, their religious upbringing, their closed mind, or why?
Because their training is to measure observable experiences. For example, in our own field of psychology, Serena's and mine, well, and of course, Diana's, our whole early approach in behavioral therapy was we only try to impact or change what we can observe, which was observable behavior, what somebody actually does in the world. Then they came along and said, well, no, maybe we can actually change thoughts. even though we can't observe them, but we can observe the outcome of that. But see, there's this obsession with being able to measure and observe phenomena, and science is still stuck there. And I think we're making progress, and I think Serena's dissertation is a step toward at least getting science to observe that when people have the experience of looking at the afterlife, whether it's true or not. See, science would say, well, we have no evidence of that. What happens when you're in hypnosis, we don't even know what really is going on, and we can't measure whether you get to the afterlife or not. But when we measure that people's emotions improve and their well-being improves, and I think maybe Serena could talk a little bit more about some of the other outcomes that she found. When we see all of that, at least science says, okay, well, this experience, whether it's real or not, actually impacts people in a very positive way.
Yeah, fair enough. What are your thoughts briefly there, Diana?
I agree. And as Matt was talking, it reminds me of the studies that are going on now into plant medicines, into MDMA and ketamine, and how those journeys are being studied and the impact of those are being studied and the protocols are being developed. And with MDMA, people are finding that their hearts are very open and they go into their true selves. And it's using the drug to take them there, to facilitate them moving into that space. The work that we are doing, whether it is with Quantum Journey or LBL, Serena studied LBL as a protocol, is doing the same thing without medicine. And so we're very interested in the outcomes that are coming out of the studies on using these various drugs to support trauma work, because we are encountering those same clients that they're coming to us. And I work with a psychotherapist who sends people to me, his clients, who need to do deeper work, and he sees it as an adjunct. So if there is an understanding that the work that we do is additive and supportive of someone's deeper understanding and appreciation of their true self and grounding them into who they are, then it adds to their quality of life. And I think what Serena found was about quality of life, that people find a better quality of life. That's measurable. Those of us who do this work know that people do find better quality because they have a better sense of who they are and a better sense of what they're facing in this lifetime.
Yeah, fair enough.
So Serena was able to measure that in those people that she studied.
Serena, that leads us across to a section in your dissertation about the meaning of life and meaning in life. So I think if we can talk about that now, and everybody feel free to come in and express your thoughts as we go along. Serena, first of all, though, what about meaning of and in life?
Yeah. Well, many people might say they measure the same thing. One way I might think of it might be that your meaning in life is what you find in this lifetime to be of value to you, and your meaning of life might be on a grander scale. But it really comes down to one standardized questionnaire called the MLQ, the Meaning in Life Questionnaire. And this questionnaire is really interesting because it measures the meaning of life or in life, measures both, across two constructs: the presence of the meaning of life and the search for the meaning of life. Interestingly, if you look at the scientific literature, the search for meaning of life, if you're someone who scores really high on searching, you are statistically more likely to be someone who may be a little more unhappy in life. A high desire to search for the meaning of life can often be correlated, for example, with a sense of depression. Because if you think about it, if you are really, really yearning and curious and you just can't get these answers about why you're here, what you're doing, what are you supposed to do with this life, and what's the grander picture, it can be pretty upsetting. Meanwhile, if you're someone who has high presence of meaning in life, meaning you have some of those answers to your questions, or at least you're satisfied, you don't have the sense of yearning, you're much more likely to be better off psychologically. And what the study found is that one's search for meaning of life goes down after LBL hypnosis. And my understanding for why is that it's because you're getting your answers. You're finally experiencing that quest, that uncomfortable yearning, feeling soothed, feeling relieved because you got what you needed. And therefore, it's also no surprise that the presence of one's meaning in life really goes up after life between lives hypnotherapy. And that speaks to, so the presence of meaning in life can go up when your search goes down, but let's say you weren't someone who is really searching for meaning of life. You're just going about life, just kind of chilling. You're not really suffering because you want to know, but you also aren't that connected to a presence of your meaning in life either. If you're someone like that and you go through an experience like LBL hypnosis, suddenly the introduction of meaning in life where previously there wasn't much of a sense can be really profound. It can be really orienting to who you are in this lifetime and what you want to do now. So that's my take on it.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, I know that once I was directed down the line of afterlife research and whatever, I found my purpose in life. I started off as an actor, radio, TV presenter, and so on. But as soon as I opened up to the whole spiritual side, I really feel I have discovered why I'm here in this incarnation. So has anybody got any thoughts that personally or professionally about this? Not just me, but I mean about other cases that you've worked with.
I just want to say something a little bit on a meta level here about meaning in life. I think our religions have really failed us in terms of helping us uncover and discover our meaning. You know, there's the whole, Christian tradition, and the meaning of life is to try, prove yourself worthy of heaven. Well, it turns out we all go to the same place, so that doesn't make any sense. And of course, even Buddhism, which says that our what we are is observing machines. We're just observers. All we're doing is watching. Well, there's not much meaning in just watching, in just recording, just being a radio receiver. And so, in some ways, I think we have been let down by our religious traditions in terms of discovering what truly is the meaning of coming to this place and going through so much struggle and so much suffering. And so, and in order to actually understand what our meaning is, we have to understand what a soul is. A soul is more than just a receiver, more than just an observer. A soul, I think, in an experience I've had with my clients, does three things. It observes, but the soul also remembers, and the soul chooses. And we come here to do all three of those things, to observe, to remember, and to choose. And all of that those are the three things that we need to do in order to learn. And those capacities to observe, to remember, to choose are what we use to learn everything. And what we learn, we upload to all. And so in some ways, it feels to me like our meaning is, those capacities are what allows us to reach our meaning and to arrive at our meaning. Which is to learn and upload everything we learn so that all of consciousness benefits from what we individual souls learn. So it feels to me when we talk about meaning that those are the kinds of things that we maybe need to talk about, as opposed to some of the religious concepts that we've been kind of stuck with.
You're burdened with, yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts on that?
I'm happy to throw in a few cents worth. I look at this whole finding meaning and finding purpose thing, and what comes to me, Barry, and after watching people access this space for 20 years now, and I'm continue to be blown away by people who still find their way into their soul even after all that time. But what I've found to be the phenomenon is that the meaning and the purpose is already there, and we simply bring it into their line of sight. I mean, for them to have selected this life, selected this body, selected this family, many of them don't believe that till they see that for themselves. But, you know, there's something in there that is about this is encoded on the fabric of your soul. And it comes from the superconscious selections that you make before you arrive. And when you are ready and you have the spiritual maturity, perhaps, to embrace it, then this will be brought into your line of sight, potentially through LBL or some other way, near-death experience, whatever it might be. But you must have that transcendent experience really to bring this to life and to make it personal. And once it's in your line of sight, then it drives you forward in ways that weren't possible before. For me, it's an awakening in some ways to what was already there in the first place. But I've never had somebody say, oh, there it is. It was hiding. It was sort of there, and it was sort of maybe seeping through in small ways. But once you know, you know.
Maybe that's what we're here for, the search, to see it seep through and then identify it and how we can work with it and how it can work with us.
Yeah.
What do you think?
My sense is that the reason that I am here is to experience this incarnation of being Diana, whatever that experience is. That's the basic. I'm here to fully be Diana, whatever that is. And I will learn from that experience. And I find that when we take down the judgments and can observe, you know, how does Diana do when she gets into certain situations and what triggers her? And then I can learn from that. It shifts me out of a judgment place that is harmful to me. And when I work with people and they begin to observe how they've been feeling things and seeing things and conditioned to understand things, they begin to question the conditioning. So I was working with someone today who was in her 14-year-old self, and her 14-year-old self loved being in nature but hated to be home because at home she always felt that she shouldn't be who she was, that she shouldn't be intuitive, that she shouldn't be the person that was curious and excited about connection with nature. And so in her 14-year-old self, she was able to feel that, and we were able to move her 14-year-old self off into nature. And once she was there, she began to see how nature was important in her life and how it fed her and how being fed changes how she perceives life. And so we moved her through that awakening process into valuing her resources as opposed to criticizing and being ashamed of who she was, which then changed how she viewed the question of what do I do now in my life? She's in a place of transition. And I see a lot of clients come not because they're in trauma, but because they're in transition or trying to figure things out. And they aren't getting answers from the human body. They need something beyond that. And when they come and they're open to receiving the guidance, the light, it opens all sorts of new opportunities and new ways of thinking about the opportunities that are present. So I see this as being, because it is very, very engaging that a person is in conversation. They're talking, they're thinking, they're feeling. And so it's not something that it's just you ask a question and they give you an answer. This is a very profound experience where someone is truly feeling on a very deep level and is changing how they feel as the result of the process and changing what they're thinking, changing the myths and the stories that they tell themselves about who they are and why they need to be the way they were. So it's very shifting, when someone learns that they don't have to be ashamed of what they now perceive as gifts. Wow, isn't that great when you can value the gifts that you have, the resources that you have, instead of being ashamed and hiding them?
Yeah.
How does that change your life? It changes your life in a major way.
Sure. Serena, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I have so many thoughts, but on what part?
I'm sorry, I missed that bit.
Oh, just on my thoughts on what part specifically.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we could move on to a different subject now, which is written out so much in your dissertation. We haven't discussed near-death experiences, or NDEs. So maybe you could set the scene a bit for us here on NDEs and your dissertation.
Yeah, well, I think one of your questions is, why hasn't the scientific community accepted the concept of the soul? It's a complicated question for many reasons, but one of them is that we can't, quote unquote, prove that there is a soul. But interestingly, the scientific community seems to have a much easier time going into research about near-death experiences than it does about spiritual experiences, which to me is odd, because a near-death experience really does look like a spiritual experience. But the scientific community definitely does have a fascination with the near-death experience. And what has largely been found, a few things that interested me in the research about near-death experiences are that they are mostly universally perceived, despite one's culture, upbringing, prior religious beliefs. And I found that to be pretty extraordinary, because one might think that if the near-death experience were something that that your brain made up as a story to make you feel better about what comes next, then that story would match what you believe in this lifetime. That's not always the case. There are reports of atheists having near-death experiences. It might be helpful to back it up and just clarify, okay, what is a near-death experience? It's a moment in which you almost died, or you could have died, or what it might even say, in which you were dead temporarily, clinically. Your heart stopped, your breathing stopped. You weren't here. You were gone somewhere else, and then you come back. What people say that they experience in this time is often a profound sense of peace. And there are many different ways of, again, science is always trying to get hard answers. Science is trying to figure out, okay, what's the quote unquote answer here? What's happening to people? And so there are different methods or ways of classifying NDEs. Some people will say, well, near-death experience is if you saw a light. Other people will say near-death experience has nothing to do with whether or not you saw a light or a tunnel-like situation. It has to do with whether you met a figure who was welcoming you to another dimension. So there are a lot of, there's dispute in the field, but it is a hot topic because we know that it happens. And it's also something that often happens in a medical setting, because where are people often almost dying? Usually in a hospital. And so that means the medical community is kind of forced to reckon with this experience of spirituality that people are reporting, whereas if it were happening anywhere but a hospital, scientists would probably have an easier time saying, whatever happens to a fringe subset of people. But when you have ER doctors, cardiologists, people with MDs saying, no, something really happened here. Scientific
The result
communities.
of near-death experiences, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The result of near-death experiences, there's a lot of research on that in terms of the impact on spirituality, on well-being, on anxiety, fear of death. And that was one of the reasons why Serena chose to do this research. She wanted to see if the same positive outcomes came about as a result of a hypnotic induction that leads us into the afterlife. And basically, the results are the same. But actually, I think the impression I have is that the results of the LBL induction are stronger and more profound, even perhaps, than the near-death experience outcomes. I want to just say one other thing about near-death experiences. There's a lot of people who've dismissed them as just anoxia, the experiences of a dying brain. But the essence of a near-death experience is that the soul leaves the body. Regardless of where it goes. Do you see the light? Do you see, whatever's going on? the essence of the experience, though, is that the soul leaves the body. And the most profound research shows that that people are able to see and identify things that are not where their body was. They're able to observe and report back phenomena that they were nowhere near and could never possibly have seen or observed, given where they were physically located. So that research shows that the soul is able to leave the body, locate itself in other places, and observe what happens in that other place. And that's just a beautiful research. It's very compelling.
And it's also more evidence for the existence of a soul.
Absolutely.
Pete.
One of the things that fascinated me in Serena's dissertation was the fact that NDEs are far more prevalent in society than what we think they might be. And I had my personal experience of this because my dear old mum, that I think you've met, Barry, she had near-death experience when I was about 12, but she never told me till I was in my 40s somewhere and gave a Journey of Souls for Christmas. And then she broke down and told me about something that happened to her when I was 12, and she died on the operating table, went down a tunnel and then came back. So I wanted to personally validate that, Serena, that it's a lot of people have them and don't talk about them. But I'd love to hear more about your comment about them being more prevalent than what we believe.
Yeah, the prevalence rate is quite high. I actually I don't want to misquote any statistics, but I will say I remember also being surprised when doing the research. I was like, wait, this is happening to a lot of people. But I think, Barry, Pete, one thing that you're speaking to is that oftentimes when an experience like this happens, but we don't have a cultural acceptance that there is a soul, there doesn't feel like there's a space that you can talk about it without maybe being judged or being perceived as unscientific. There's always this fear that someone could say, oh, it's anoxia, it wasn't a quote unquote real experience. And so oftentimes, to avoid the pain of being denied, a lot of people just keep it to themselves. But when you ask people in a survey to disclose, and people know, okay, well, no one's going to judge me for saying that I had one or didn't, or that I think I had one or I didn't think I had one, you find out that a lot more people have experienced one. An analogy might be if you're walking down a crowded block, there's going to be at least one person who's had a near-death experience.
Interesting.
Well, my mother received her own validation when it was medical error, and she was over anaesthetized. And when she floated out of her body and heard what the doctor said to the anaesthetist, and when she confronted him with it in the ward, in the post-op debrief, when he ran screaming away, she had her own validation at that time. But it was, it was a fascinating experience for her. But, I love, and Matt spoke too about the connections with LBL and NDE, because, you don't have to go through all of the pain and medical error and all of the things in order to touch your own soul, when we can offer an easier path. And that's one of the things I love about the work that you've done, is that you have brought validation to what we've been doing for decades. And now we have some statistical basis to be able to take this forward, which is why we really wanted to support this work and provide a forum, even in a small way today, for you to be able to say this, share this incredible piece of work that you've done.
One of the things I found with my research on NDEs is the fact that every single person who's had one, their life has changed completely afterwards. Some have good reactions, some have negative, but they're never the same again. So you have to wonder about why they happen and how it helps the person one way or the other, or at least gives them the opportunity to change their life. What do you think, Tina?
I think my experience is observing clients who come for LBL experiences, and that their lives are changed because they know they are different than they thought they were. They know they're not their conditioning, and they learn something about themselves that fundamentally changes how they feel about themselves and their experience. So I haven't experienced an NDE, but I certainly have experienced a lot of transformation in people who begin to know who they are, and they begin to see that their life isn't all that they thought it was, and that the challenges and pains are not what makes them up. It's what they're experiencing. And it fundamentally changes the trajectory of people's lives. And that happens time after time. I have clients who come back and say, that was really profound. I don't know how to explain how different my life is today because of this experience. And one of the ways that I find with people who do this work is they find relief in being able to talk about who they are and what their experiences are, that they're not being judged for experiencing and talking about their souls, about talking about what they experience, how they perceive the world. And they feel that there is an expansiveness that they've gained, and it's safer for them to be able to be who they actually are. And people are seeking safety. I mean, safety is a big issue in today's world. And if you can, in working with people, help them support an expansion of their safe spaces and be safer as who they really are, their life is qualitatively different. If you feel safe in your being and who you are and trust yourself, that's completely different than if you come in cowering and feeling victimized. And that we see that happening all the time with people, simply because they know who they are.
Fair enough. Now, thank you all. To wrap up our panel discussion, one of the points that you make is increased spirituality correlates with psychological well-being. And I found that quite fascinating. Serena, would you like to start off, and we all have a little comment about that one, just to wrap up our discussion today?
Yeah, I think I'll say that spiritual work is psychological work, and vice versa. Psychological work is spiritual work. I think in this conversation, we've talked a lot about how there can feel like there's this tension between science and spirituality. But I think that when you look at science, psychology, spirituality, you can actually find a lot of harmony in that there's well-being on the other side of a spiritual pursuit, in the same way that there's well-being on the other side of a psychological pursuit. What that means for me is that life between lives, hypnosis, is a form of therapy. And it's often one that people go to if they're in pain, in the same way that you might go to a talk therapist or a behavioral therapist, a psychoanalytic therapist. Life between lives hypnotherapy is one of those options within those domains when it comes to psychological intervention.
Fair enough. Matt, what do you equate with spiritual and psychological well-being linked together? What is psychological well-being spiritually?
Well, I think that spiritual well-being, the way I would define it, is living in alignment with your values, your spiritual values. So the more closely aligned you are with your values and who you want to be in this life, the more deep sense of contentment you have. You can be in pain, you can be struggling, but on another level, there's a deep spiritual contentment from being in alignment with your values. So in my view, spirituality is action. It's not just, kind of being in touch with the universe. It's actually doing things in alignment with your values and living your values. And when you do that, there's this deep, deep, deep spiritual contentment. And I think psychological well-being is very similar. Psychological well-being comes from living life well. and living life in a way that fits who you want to be and how you want to be in the world, and who you want to be and how you want to be in your relationships. So I think there's a very, and I'm sort of agreeing with Serena here, there's a very close alignment between psychological and spiritual well-being, because both of them are based on behavior, on what we do, not just on what we feel or what we sense or some kind of awareness of belonging to something greater than ourselves, but it's what we are actually doing in the world that gives us that well-being.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Diana, how would you sum it up from the Institute's point of view?
Our role is to carry Michael's work outward from him, that he was a pioneer in supporting people and connecting to consciousness and aligning with their true purpose and finding who they are so they can live their best lives. And we're not stuck in old protocols. We're looking for really helping people do that work, however they can do it. And we've found that this process of supporting people and expanding into the trueness of self supports them having a better life in this lifetime. It isn't just about, oh, I'm a soul and I'm an old soul, and aren't I good because I'm an old soul? I'm a better soul because I'm older than you, and I'm a blue soul or purple soul or whatever kind of soul I am, depending on how you describe levels of soulness. It isn't about that. It's not about the ego. It is really being able to experience of the best possible life, which was what Michael was trying to help people do. And he found that being able to be in your true self allows you then to align not just with what you're experiencing in an incarnation, but the trueness of your values over time that your soul holds, so that you're profoundly aligned, not just aligned in the moment. And that can give you a deep sense of purpose and connection and support you in having courage and moving through trauma and moving through life that has hardships. And he called it, Earth School, a very difficult place. And so we're here not just to survive, but to thrive. And his work and the Institute carries on that work to support people in learning of their connections, of learning of the greater self that one can be when one opens up one's eyes and can be more than just this incarnation.
Okay, thank you. When you talked about old souls, it reminded me some so-called expert I heard years ago saying that if you're an old soul, maybe it's because you haven't learned your lessons after you keep on coming back to try and learn them. So it opens up a whole new direction. Pete, just to wrap it all up, how are your thoughts, how are your feelings right now?
I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Wish I could have them every day. And I guess in some ways we do, but not with this group. And I've really enjoyed this. To answer the question that you put to the group, Barry, for me, I think the real power of this work is the remembering that separation is a myth and that we are never alone. And our soul is in consort with us the whole time. We are this magnificent duality of the spiritual being and the being and the human experience. Everything is connected. Michael found this in his first accidental LBL in 1968 when a lady was desperately debilitated by loneliness, and so she popped into a soul group and found all her friends. And that story's been out on YouTube a lot over the years. But this is it. We're all connected. We're all one consciousness. Matt was talking about the collective consciousness. Everything that we do goes into that collective, and I so believe that. I think Carl Jung was onto something with the collective consciousness. He just didn't know that he thought it was all of humanity, but I think it's the whole universe. So, for me, it's what this work gives us is it gives us a journey into an absence of separation where we can be one with all there is. And that's what I love about the work that we do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I think, Serena, final word from you. Your dissertation, you've heard various people talk today. Have you got a very nice little wrap-up for us there?
I think feeling a call to action right now. I am noticing that the world of science maybe has some catching up to do, and so I'm thinking about next steps. I'm grateful to have one foot in both communities, or I guess both feet in both communities, in science and in spirituality.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for being part of our very first panel discussion on Radio Out There, and also Radio Out There on YouTube. And there's a lot more to come. Okay, see you next time.